I'm Paul McNiel. I'm the founder of the Wagon Box, the West's last resort here in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. And excited this morning to be interviewing Jack Spiezio. He's got a book that recently came out, Something of the Springtime. And what we're going to discuss is his, he published an essay recently on the Wagon Box Substack, which is probably where you're watching this, about the relationship between America and Europe and the question of the West. And what we're discuss is, what is the future of the West? Does the West even still exist? And how should America relate to Europe in this new era that's unfolding? So I'm excited to be here at the Wagon Box again. And my old friend, Jack, where you at?
Hello, Mr. Paul. Thank you very much.
Jack, good to see you, man. I wish you were here. So just by way of recap, Jack and I met here at the Wagon Box about a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
The Wagon Box was just getting going, and our very first event was a writer's retreat. And Jack showed up, and it was a special week. It was a great time. We read each other's writings. We ate great food. We stayed up late in front of the fire and outside under the stars here in the mountains and discussing all the most important things. We really felt like we were on the cusp of something important. And I still feel that way. I feel like the Wagon Box is really at the frontier, you might say, of what's going on with the West, which is to some large degree with the world. I mean, the West is such an interesting term. That writer's retreat, the question we were asking, the question I posed at that writer's retreat was, what is the future of the West? Does it still exist, and what is its future? And it was a little bit of a double entendre, because the question would be like, are you talking about the American West, cowboys and Indians and the mountains and, the sort of free-spirited American frontier? Or are we talking about Western civilization? And I was thinking both. And because to me, actually, the two are tied. If you think about the American West, sure, there's this idea of the frontier, the wilderness, this untamed country. But why are we looking at it? I mean, there's untamed country in the Mongolian steppe too, and that's not the West.
Yeah.
We're looking at the West because it's also where Europeans are, right? Like, in a sense, the two are tied. The West is this interface between ancient European tradition, culture, understanding of the world, and some kind of a wilderness. And then, of course, there's the larger project of the West, Western civilization, Europe, and then America and every place it touched, which, eventually was the entire globe. So John,
maybe Mars as well.
What's that?
See. It may be Mars as well, but we'll see.
It may include Mars. That's on the table now. Crazy times, exciting times, politically, geopolitically. World history seems to be at some kind of inflection point, and it's hard to tell where things are going. The West is a project that seemed to be in its sort of final phases. Maybe it's dying, maybe something new is emerging, or maybe it's reimagining itself. And I believe that the Wagon Box is kind of part of that project of reimagining itself. Jack is an author, among other things, a scholar, and soon to be part of the U.S. military. And so he has a particular take. He spent some time in Europe. He's he's been here. He's been in every event that the Wagon Box ever had. I've only mostly spent time with him here, a little bit in his home there in New York City. He's coming to us from Manhattan. Yeah, good to see you, Matt.
Good to see you as well, Paul. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't know where exactly the intro was going to end and where I should jump in, so I was sort of happy.
Nobody never does.
But I really think you're onto something to see the West not only as a geographical place, but also as a sort of project and a sort of mentality. So going back to the very earliest days of the West's self-understanding, when it really begins with the Greeks going off against the Persians and then the Romans going off against other forces to the east, or all the way later when it's the spirit of the laws talking about Eastern despotism, the West was really self-understanding as a sort of project of non-submission to despotism and tyranny. The West has always understood itself as something that allows for laxity and for room for growth and for individual freedom and dynamism and change.
Yeah, this seems like the individual is a central theme in the West, but maybe that's been taken too far recently and sort of led to this partial collapse of the West. I don't know. What do you think? What is the relationship of the individual to the project of the West? Because it's not just rugged individualism. It's something more, but also that has something to do with how Christianity, in some ways, sort of reimagined and reinvented the West. Because Christianity, in many ways, sort of brought the individual before God as a very novel concept. Like before that, yeah. Go ahead.
I think that's very much true. There's a sort of bad reading of Christianity, which is also a bad reading of Western civilization. I heard a rumor. I don't know if this is true, but I heard a rumor lately that Peter Thiel had given a speech in which he claimed that Ayn Rand's objectivist heroes are actually the peak of Christian morality. I don't think that's correct. And I think that's sort of what you're alluding to. There is a possibility of excessive individualism giving itself over to the antithesis of Christianity. It becomes sort of Luciferian in an effect, because I think that proper individualism is not about asserting oneself as totally absolute from everything. It's about understanding oneself within a greater scheme of things and doing your best in that particular role rather than throwing up everything.
Exactly. It's this interesting sort of intransitive dynamic where, on the one hand, out of this history of humans being part of sort of subsumed by some kind of empire, some kind of culture, you have the individual emerges, but then you look at the picture of Christ as an individual, and the crucifixion is the individual sacrificing themselves, but sacrificing themselves part and on behalf of the whole, right? And so you think of Jim Bridger, or any of the sort of heroes of the West, Bowie or Crockett or any of these guys, and sure, they're rugged individuals, but they're not completely self-defining, right? They're individuals, right? They define themselves as part of this larger project. They're really, in a sense, like European avant-garde, or they're these sort of individuals who are out in the wilderness, out in the rugged West, in this environment that challenges them and that in many cases ultimately kills them, but they represent something bigger. They're not just themselves. They represent the West, this project that is come to include and obviously be defined by Christianity, by certain values, by certain understandings of the world and the relationship between people and the world. So For the context of this conversation, first of all, you have a book out, just came out, Something of the Springtime, which explores many of these themes. And we encourage everybody to read it. I've read it, have enjoyed it. And
One of the first readers. He's in the acknowledgments.
One of the first readers. Really? Excellent.
You're in the acknowledgments,
so
yeah.
that was, you workshopped the first 10 pages of that novel at that writer's retreat here at the Wagon Box a year and a half ago. Now it's been published. It's out. It's starting to pick up traction. People are reading it. They're enjoying it. They're realizing, like, hey, man, there's
cracked 1,000 copies. So
yeah, which for a first novel is amazing. It's Passage Publishing. But beyond that, you recently published an essay on our Substack that kind of is just a prologue to the question of what is the relationship between America and Europe. And there's an interesting thing going on right now between America and Europe. I feel like we're redefining the relationship with the new administration and with the challenges facing Europe, with their sort of uncertainties on their Eastern front. Yeah. They're trying to decide, who they are and what they are with Brexit and everything. And America seems to be also in the process of kind of redefining itself. Who are we? And I think it's a great time to explore your question is, what is the relationship between America and Europe? And how does this relate to both the past of America and Europe, their past relationship, which I think most people contextualize as a tension, but I think you're posing we need to reconcile and acknowledge the mutual hostility, but also what each has gained from the other, which is extremely important. But also I'd like to look at, by the end of this interview, what is the future? What does it look like? Our relationship with Europe. So starting out, how would you sort of imagine the American project in the context of its relationship to Europe?
All right. I think there are a few different headings. I think the first and most important thing to talk about is immigration. So coming off of the last election, I think it's pretty clear that there is a general mandate against illegal immigration. There's sort of been a temperature check on the country to see how people feel about things, and it's become clear that overall the majority of people are not in favor of allowing illegal immigration to continue unchecked in the way that it has for the past maybe 10, 15, 20 years. This leads to the question of what do we do about legal immigration? Are we going to make the process easier? Are we going to let in a greater number of legal immigrants? Or is the underlying dissatisfaction that makes people uncomfortable with illegal immigration also something to do with legal immigration as well?
Yeah, no, that's looking at the present and the future, but I'm thinking more like is in terms of sort of America's identity and history.
Oh, okay. I thought you wanted to talk about like what policy.
How do we tie in with the European project? I mean, what is America in terms of Europe? How do we relate in sort of a foundational way? Your essay starts
in a foundational way. We were founded by
Europeans, yeah. And your essay starts out with this poem.
Yeah.
Tell us about this poem and tell us about how it sort of frames your idea of the relationship between America and Europe.
Sure. So it's called a few verses on the prospect of planting the arts and sciences in the Americas or something like that. It's by George Berkeley. You probably know about Berkeley. He was an Anglo-Irish cleric, eventually a bishop, and also a scholar at Trinity College, Dublin. And obviously had all sorts of weird ideas about absolute idealism and the world not really existing and things like that. But sort of as an aside, he became very taken with the idea of the New World. He thought that Europe was completely exhausted. It was completely sclerotic, maybe is a term we would use these days. The bureaucracies were too deeply embedded. The aristocracy was completely corrupt and completely out of energy. So what we needed to do was take European civilization and just put it in America. And that would revitalize everything, and we would have great culture and laws and society and civilization out of that. Unfortunately, his plan did fail, because as soon as he left, it turns out he may have been a very charismatic figure. So once he was out of London, people weren't really interested in what they'd been trying to do before. And so Robert Peel, the prime minister, basically sent him a letter and said, actually, we're not going to give you the money that we had promised you as a parliamentary grant. So he abandoned the project and came back to London.
But I mean, his particular project failed. But I mean, I think in some ways the Wagon Box itself. I mean, you look behind me here. Here's the Wagon Box library right around the corner.
Right. Yeah. So his particular project failed, but this
failed. But we're still trying to.
But this is 1720s, 1720s, 1730s. So 50 years later, obviously
the entire American
project. The colonies declare independence, and they establish themselves as some sort of a new project. But I think what Paul wants to get down to, what the meat of the conversation that you want to get into, is when America did wind up founding itself as a new nation in 1776, how did it understand its relationship to Europe? Did it see itself as a European country, or did it see itself as something that was antagonistic to the old world? And I think that's not something that is totally clear, cut, and dry. I think we had a civil war back in the 1860s, to a large extent because of this. To a large extent, Southerners who had a sort of genteel sensibility where they saw themselves as classical European aristocrats, had very close mercantile ties, especially with Britain. They came into conflict with the North, which saw itself as something entirely new and industrial, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to make it seem as if this is something that was answered from the get-go and had a very clear answer. It's something that's always been at the heart of America's self-understanding, is that this question is unanswered.
Yeah, I feel like America is sort of defined by this tension between this rootedness in a culture, in a literary tradition, in a religious tradition, in this idea of the individual and the whole framework that Europe provided, but it carries that into this untamed land and sort of preserves this tension of civilization versus something new, something vibrant, something exciting. And I think what your essay was suggesting is that there's a partnership to be had there, and that what what could be fruitful would be a return of both to recognize the advantage of the other. So for America to realize, despite all its dynamism, despite all its wealth, I mean, America's GDP, by any measurement, America has just been going straight upwards. And by many measurements, Europe has been crumbling. GDP, cultural influence.
We're stagnating. Best case scenario, stagnating.
Best case scenario, stagnating. And even, when you talk to European, I think they have a sense that things are falling apart, that the best years are behind us. Of course, you read, like Wellebeck, and it's like definitely like things are very bad. Things are falling apart.
For no reason.
But then, Europeans' sort of sense of Americans, when an American visits Europe, for all this sort of, talk about, they hated American or whatever, they like Americans because Americans are dynamic and they're excited and they're making money and they're building things. And sure, there's obviously people doing great things in Europe, but they don't have that same sense of excitement and
Yeah, I don't know if you actually watched it, but I spoke about this a little bit in that interview I did with the Prudentialist. You know, when I
yeah,
was over in England, I was like Kevin Bacon in Footloose. You know, everyone was so stodgy and so pent up that when the American comes in, suddenly all this energy is released, and they like this a lot. It's very good, and I think that that does really have some sort of a historical basis in the most energetic people coming out of Europe into America. But also now when I come back to America, people see me as sort of stodgy and priggish and very European. So it
you
does
are
go
you are that liminal case. To
exactly.
Americans, you're European. To Europeans, you're American.
It's
And
very odd.
I think it highlights this sort of dual nature of this, the two sides of this coin that is, you know, looking backwards and rooted in the classics, in the history, the Greco-Roman history, then the Christian history that infused all that and sort of reoriented it. But then the sort of dynamism of America,
Of industry.
of industry, of exploration, of building.
Yes, exploration, yes.
And
all the
so
exploration that wound up exploring America came from Europe. You know, they
Sure.
had that energy at one point. They had that dynamism. It wound up coming to America. So I think
yeah, what I'd like to get to is a future of like how that could work together. But we could start with maybe looking at what went wrong, or what is going wrong with Europe and with America and with our relationship.
what is going wrong in America? I think I said in the essay that America is suffering from a lack of roots and Europe is suffering from a lack of energy. That's a very poetic way of putting it. But in technical terms, I think you've definitely heard, because you're in all these doomer optimist circles, that growth for growth's sake is the ideology of a cancer cell. And I think that is what America is suffering under. It has a tremendous amount of energy. It has a tremendous amount of talent. It has the best human capital in the world. Everybody wants to come here and participate in our business, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't know what we're trying to achieve. We don't know what we're trying to build. We don't have a sense of what absolute goodness or beauty and truth mean, what sort of a society we would like to achieve. So we just throw all that energy at the wall and let whatever gets created get created. It's totally lacking in direction. Whereas Europe, on the other hand, is sort of trying to hold on to a sense of respectability and ancientness and a sort of overarching higher level conservatism, which is mere submission to whoever happens to be in charge at the time, that they wind up stifling anyone who wants to upset the current regimes or anybody who wants to come up with great new businesses, maybe. So they all come to America and that sort of a thing.
So
I don't know.
What I'm getting is that, yeah, that America has taken their strengths, dynamism, industry, new ideas.
Yeah, the term I use in the essay is pressure release valve, and I think that's a good term, because.
But the temptation is be all steam.
Is to be all steam, exactly, and then it just dissipates.
Just dissipate and not, and that they're unrooted. They're deracinated from these deeper foundations, ideological, cultural, spiritual. And those all come from Europe.
Yeah. So let's take an example. You know, so let's go and look at architecture. Let's go and look at architecture that was built by the British Raj. So in India in the Victorian era, you go back, you'll see these beautiful, beautiful buildings built in India in the Victorian era, and they'll look very similar to very beautiful, beautiful buildings that were being built in England at the exact same time, because the English had a very strong sense of self. They had a sense of what their civilization was and what their sense of beauty was and what their sense of purpose was, and a storied, centuries-long tradition that they were tied into, and they wanted to spread that across the world. when America goes and starts colonizing other places, you don't get beautiful buildings. What you get is a pride flag over the embassy, you know. So,
And even the embassy is ugly. I mean,
and even the embassy is ugly. The building itself is ugly.
Yeah, one tension I think that is particularly timely is the tension between democracy and something else. And you hear this term democracy, our democracy, it's just pounded by, all the media. Our democracy is under threat, and nobody's quite sure even what that means. But it's interesting to me. Somebody pointed out that democracies, the more democratic they are, the more ugly their government buildings. I mean, you look at the ugliest building in any town in America, it's going to be either the post office or the school or the library. Democracies build ugly buildings. But the European tradition is for community buildings or any kind of sort of civic building to be beautiful. And so how do we resolve that tension where in democracies,
I don't think it's a necessary tension. I don't think it's a necessary tension. I think it's a circumstantial tension, because America was, I don't know if you want to call it a democracy. Obviously, there wasn't universal suffrage, but America was functionally a democracy for a very long time before it started building very, very ugly buildings. And it continued to build very, very beautiful buildings while it was more or less a democracy for, I don't know, 150 years.
So but eventually, the American values of efficiency and sort of like productivity overtook these deeper European sensibilities of beauty.
I don't think it was a problem of values. I think it was a problem of bitterness. I think that because I think the problem that you're coming up against isn't that a lot of people look at these ugly buildings that you're describing and say it's okay that they're ugly because they're so efficient. What you're coming up against is a lot of people looking at these very ugly buildings and saying, oh no, actually they're really beautiful. You just don't get it. And the reason that you don't get it is because you've been more or less brainwashed by right-wing conspiracies into thinking that architecture that is classical in some way or other is better than brutalism or something like that.
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, the average post office or high school, I don't think is like some brutalist.
I mean, sure, but let's take the Seagrams building.
They're not. I don't even trying to be beautiful. And I guess the question is like.
But that's the thing; they really are. So, like, look at Mies van der Rohe and the buildings that he designed for around Chicago, or the Seagrams building in New York. These are the sort of buildings that you're describing that are very ugly and very anti-classical. The reason that they were built was not for pure efficiency. There was an argument that there was a new sort of a beauty in them, and that beauty had not been appreciated in the past, because the classical senses of beauty, which are really only a social construct, had prevented people from realizing how beautiful these sorts of buildings were. That's how we got to this point in the first place. It wasn't merely an argument from efficiency. Maybe the cheapness of producing things like this is a behind-the-scenes excuse for why we allow ourselves to suffer them. But I think what you're dealing with at a higher level is an unwillingness to call a spade and to say that an ugly building is.
There's a certain like rebelliousness against, maybe like America is like, well, we're going to reject this European tradition, and this European tradition happens to be like beautiful buildings, like patently beautiful buildings, and so we're going to intentionally build these sort of challenging, stark.
Yeah, and here's the funny thing. The funny thing about it is that the idea to do that actually came from Europe. That's not, Americans didn't come up with doing this in the first place. This was a very, very left-wing European ideal that started up and then came into America later on. But
so the truly American thing is to lean back into the European roots
and say,
and the idea of what's that?
Forget you. I don't care about Le Corbusier or whatever. I'm gonna build beautiful buildings.
So let's talk about the potential future. What does it look like to you, the relationship between America and Europe, both practically and then in terms of self-understanding and cooperation on this project of civilization?
I think practically what it means is how we wind up resolving this war with Russia. I think the way that we wind up resolving this war with Russia is going to set the table for everything going forward. So it looks like one way or another, Trump wants to end the war. Does he want to end the war just in a way to get America out of it? And then Europe is going to carry on the war. France, Germany, perhaps Britain are going to keep supplying arms to Ukraine. In the meantime, is he going to settle it all totally, and then nobody in Europe is going to be providing arms to Ukraine? But then potentially there will be other fronts opening. Is there going to still be a tension between the Baltic states and Russia? Or are we going to quash the beef entirely? You know?
Yeah, explain to me, unpack to me how that ties in with the questions we were just talking about. Like, to me, that seems sort of a geopolitical blip, and who cares? How does that really tie into the question of self-identity and future?
Because right now, when America is in this redefining itself moment, it has to decide if it wants to be totally isolationist and cut itself off from Europe, which it may do. It may say to Putin, all right, we're just going to pull ourselves out of this conflict entirely. Maybe European states are going to continue giving arms to Ukraine, but don't mess with us. Don't attack us at all. We're fine with whatever you want to do in Ukraine. Or America is going to say, we want to make sure that Europe is not going to be dragged into some sort of catastrophic war between Germany, let's say, Poland, let's say, and Russia. We don't want that to happen. We want to make sure that it doesn't happen because we're committed to maintaining the integrity of Europe, and also because we want to have Russia on the side of Europe. We want to bring Russia into that fold. That's going to be a much more complex piece, and that's going to require a lot much more.
Yeah, that itself is this weird tension that nobody's really brought up, or I'm sure people have brought up, but I haven't seen, is, I mean, Russia's own tenuous relationship with Europe. I mean,
yes.
Through the 1800s, all you see is sort of this kind of backwards Eastern, wasteland, desperately trying to be cool in the eyes of the West, right? And grappling with, no, we're cool in our own right, and the Slavophiles sort of versus the Europhiles, and that's still playing itself out. And the fact is, for all Russia's antagonism against the West, they still love the West. They want to be part of it. I mean,
they do.
150 years ago, all the Russian elites were deeply steeped in European culture. They spoke French.
Yeah, the Tolstoy characters who don't even speak Russian.
I mean, there he is, right over there. Tolstoy's right behind us. We've got his collected works up here.
I don't know, whatever my wife's got here at the back.
So, I mean, and
this is Kuprin.
Interesting side note, Jack's wife has Russian heritage, right?
Yeah.
And speaks Russian.
Yeah, fluently. And
fluently.
We're with it a little bit.
And so this tension runs right to your own, your own family, your own house. And I've always been a huge fan of Russian literature. And part of it is, in its own way, and maybe this is going to be an interesting part of the future, is that maybe America and Russia represent two separate sort of European post-European projects or projects that are sort of the European zeitgeist transplanted into some wilderness. And in America, it's pushed west, and its emphasis is on the rugged individual and sort of this global sense of domination. And then pulled east, it's maybe something else, maybe sort of not so much rugged individual, but some Eastern concept of a country and a culture and submission to these ancient norms or something. How is that going to play out? You have Russia, you have Europe in the middle, and you have Russia and America sort of.
How is it going to play out? The thing is, it really is up to us.
That's what we're trying to figure out.
It is
how
kind
are we
of
going to play it out?
So to get to the geopolitical brass tacks, Russia is in Ukraine in the first place because they want to make sure that they can delimit as much as possible NATO having direct access onto Russian territory.
Sure.
Fair enough. What if NATO were not viewed as an existential enemy of Russia? What if Russia and NATO could cooperate? Suddenly the entire game changes. So that game isn't necessarily going to change. If America says, we're done with NATO, we're not going to do this thing anymore, and we're going to stop supplying arms to Ukraine, then all the European states are still in NATO. Their leading powers, their leading parties are still committed to this project. NATO remains some sort of a threat to Russia. So Russia has some sort of an impetus to invade, let's say, the Baltic states or Poland. It makes sense at that point. If America can achieve a proper reconciliation with Russia, and suddenly Russia and NATO aren't enemies, but working together, that's much better for Europe. Europe doesn't have to exist under this constant threat. And
do you think this is easier reimagined? I mean, I'm thinking about suddenly, this is kind of new to me, and it's a little bit exciting. This idea of just each party, Europe, America, Russia, kind of partnering up on a mutual acknowledgement of their common roles, as sort of Europe as acknowledgement. Hey, we owe to you our self-understanding in terms of culture and history, but we have our particular spin on it. And America's sort of dynamic and exciting and a little bit retarded. And Russia has their own.
It doesn't just have to be submission on a sort of, priestly basis, like, oh, Europe is, the old. Europe can be dynamic. Again, like I said, all of the dynamism that discovered the New World came from Europe. And even after that, the Industrial Revolution occurred in Birmingham. The Industrial Revolution occurred in Chemnitz, in towns in Germany that you've never heard of. It's the Europeans have this within their capacity. But
and as much as I love Russian literature, and I love it specifically because it's so very Russian, but it really wouldn't exist without its cultural exchange with Europe. I mean, all these great Russian authors, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Pushkin, all these guys are deeply steeped in European literature. And I mean, the very idea of the novel itself is sort of something that came out of Europe. But I guess, what does that look like moving forward? Do they need a common enemy? Does it have to be sort of?
Well, they already have a common enemy. It's not necessarily a common enemy for everybody, but obviously China is the dragon in the world.
China's the dragon.
Because what's sort of behind in the background for everybody is that China wants to invade Siberia and capitalize on a lot of natural resources that they have there that currently Russia isn't really doing anything with. So again, as much as we like Russia, it is sort of a backwards gangsterist state. It's not necessarily the best on increasing industrial capacity very slowly or very quickly.
So in the near term, you see a NATO America-Russian alliance over and against China and the East, or can it be its own thing without having a common enemy?
It doesn't have to have a common enemy. It can be its own thing. But if you do want to have a common enemy, the common enemy is already there.
The PRC.
Yeah, because people talk to me a lot about BRICS and how they think BRICS is going to play out. And I'm very, very pessimistic about that union being something meaningful politically in the long term, because they're all in that union entirely out of convenience. It's a marriage of convenience. They all hate each other separately. Russia and China are right next to each other, and China wants to invade Russia as soon as it can. India and China are constantly going at war with each other. South Africa is a failed state. And Brazil is kind of just, it routinely puts itself up for grabs depending on who's the president and who can highest bidder. So it's not a meaningful alternative to the globally led American system that currently exists. Russia would be much better off being brought into the current American European system rather than trying to have this motley crew against it.
Now, when you talk about a sort of NATO-Russian coming to terms, hey, we're partners in this project, we're, in many ways, ancient allies. I mean, obviously, NATO and Russia were allies in World War II. And against the Bolsheviks and Bolshevism as an idea, Bolshevism seems to be largely cashed out. And so now you have, China and many Eastern Asian nations. I'm not sure what the ideological foundations of them are, but I'm curious if you see this in terms of a reemergence of a European, with its America and Russian sort of cohorts, hegemony, or are you seeing it under this new umbrella, this sort of Duginist idea of a multipolar, polycentric world where all these different groups kind of have their own seed and there's no overarching ideology that sort of plows over everything? The American liberalism is craving something else.
I guess it's a little bit in between, because it's naive to assume that there's never going to be some sort of overarching cooperation. There's always going to be some overarching cooperation, but it's also naive to assume that that overarching cooperation is complete. Obviously, the states within a functional empire may have relationships and secret understandings with states that border them geographically, but maybe aren't aligned on the surface. But I would say it's more like the former is what I have in mind, and less, because the Duginist project is always an end of history sort of a project. So the Duginist project is always something that tends towards having been done with the entirety of everything. And now Russia just runs this, and America runs that, and China runs that, and then nobody has to fight ever again forever. We're all just done, basically. And I'm skeptical of that as a situation. I think that there are always going to be various conflicts going on in one way or another.
Sure. Now, you're an author, you're a classicist, you're an American who went to school out in Oxford, studied the classics, and Old English and Norse, and your book explores this tension. Your book is about a protagonist who's an American, who's at Oxford, who's trying to figure out his own identity, and within the framework of the relationship between sort of America's newness and Europe's sort of old, interesting, deep, heritage. And I'm curious sort of how that applies to the current moment. What does that mean for now? What are some of the sort of cultural avenues for bringing about your desired end for the relationship between America and Europe? What are the cultural avenues there? Besides people buying and reading your book, which is obviously the first step.
Besides people buying and reading my book. What are the things that you read on a day-to-day basis? Do you read a lot? Do you study other languages? Which other languages do you study? Do you go to museums very often? What sort of museums? What sort of art are you interested in? Do you produce any art? These are questions for an individual person to be asking himself.
Sounds to me like maybe you're just suggesting a conscious rerouting in the European tradition. Not just I happen to read the classics of Western civilization, but to like consciously acknowledge, you know, as an American, as a thoughtful part of this dynamic project, I'm still rerouting myself in these ancient languages, you know, Greek and Latin.
Well, it's like the difference between going to a friend's house and admiring your own house. So when you're reading Homer, you're reading Chaucer, or you're reading Spencer, you shouldn't be reading it and thinking, well, this is just a nice book. This is your book. This is your house.
That's good.
You live here.
Or at least this is maybe grandma's house.
This is maybe it's grandma's house. This is grandma's house. This is
part of who I am. This informs who I am.
Exactly. And you can still read other things. You know that I do. I read a lot of Japanese literature. I read a lot of Sanskrit literature, which obviously has its own ties in a certain way. But
Indo-European connection.
Yeah. But when I'm reading Homer, I'm thinking, all right, I'm walking around my palace and here I am. I'm reading Chaucer and I think, here I am. You know, I am at home here. This is my home. This is where I live.
I feel like this ties kind of back in with the Wagon Box project and with the question we started with, like, what is the West? I mean, if you look at the Old West, the pioneers crossing, you know, they've got a covered wagon, they're headed west, they're headed, you know, into Indian territory, this foreign culture, this foreign land, but they're carrying with them a Bible, maybe a copy of Homer, maybe a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on Common Law. You know, they're carrying with them these relics of European civilization. And I feel like that's what the Wagon Box project is. I mean, we've got horses, we've got the Bighorn Mountains right behind us. We're deep in the West, but we have also, you know, the remnants, the best thoughts of Europe here on the wall. And I feel like that's maybe what you're suggesting, is that you plow into the frontier, you know, excited about the unknown and what you can build. But let's not forget to carry with us, you know, what really forms our identity. I mean, we were talking earlier about what defines the West, the American West, you know, what makes a Western a Western. Part of it is this hostile and sort of untamed and untouched territory. But it's not just that, right?
American Westerns, they're Arthurian. It's
Arthurian. This European, this dynamic between the cowboy and this is what it comes down to is
he's an Arthurian knight going around establishing justice. He's Artegal in the Fairy Queen. You know, he just believes in justice for its own sake.
The cowboy is rooted in European lore. And you think about like a cowboy out west, if they're just you know, in Antarctica or whatever, sure, it's wild and tamed, or the Mongolian steppe, but what makes the American West interesting is this tension between this untamed landscape and ideology with the European lore and the European history and the European roots. And so you're suggesting lean into the dynamism, the excitement of the, you know, the boldly going where no man has gone before. Maybe the new.
Get on the Trump train.
What's that?
Get on the Trump train.
Get on.
Occupy Mars.
Occupy Mars. So
I don't care that much about Mars, to be honest. I know,
I'm
but
I'm kind of ambivalent about Mars.
it's a way of getting people excited about a big project.
And I think what people get excited about Mars is not so much the practical reality of Mars, but returning to this idea of there is an untamed frontier,
yeah,
and we can sort of look towards it, and it can inspire us to sort of see our own lives as this tension between this unknown future and the known past that's beautiful and has many good things and has many bad things. And so, like, you can only, I think, thoughtfully shed the worst parts of your past by leaning into and embracing the best parts. And sort of only through love can you really evaluate those things and make the most of them. Wouldn't you say?
yeah, I think so. I think the future justifies the past, and we move into the future to understand the past and the exitus acta probant to a certain extent, as is written on the arch in Washington Square Park down here in Manhattan.
Translate for us.
The ends justify the means is written on the Washington Square arch, but not that I would endorse that wholeheartedly.
No, but I mean, to us, in a sense, the ends inform the means, and sort of outside of time, if you think of sort of, from God's perspective, it is just unfolding, like this sort of, you have this like Boethian view of history, where it's just kind of this scroll unrolled, and God sees it from beginning to end, and the end sort of informs the process, informs the whole thing, and so they're all tied together. And I guess the bottom line is, on the one hand, we need to delve into our roots, particularly our European roots and our Christian roots and our, Greco-Roman Anglo roots.
Yeah. Have I given enough of an answer for that? Have we discussed that enough? Do you feel like it's come across?
I mean, I don't think so. I think we could, discuss it forever. I think we could delve into it. But I feel like you've certainly given us enough of a direction and enough of a posture. Yeah, I mean, did you have any final thoughts about that posture, about sort of that project?
The final posture.
I'd like to kind of tie back into your book. So James, the main character in your book, he's trying to figure out who he is and what he's doing there in Oxford, and his roots are back in New England, and
the roots are in Old England,
but his deeper roots are back in Old England, and it doesn't really play out yet. I'm hoping there'll be a second installment. We've got many books ahead for you to explore these questions. But what would you sort of posit as either the lesson he learns, or something that you sort of as an outsider would encourage James to consider as an American in Europe, or possibly he goes back to America as an American informed by European roots and sensibilities?
I would tell him that the tree grows many branches, and it's not a shame to be a later bloom, but perhaps out of a certain insecurity or discomfort with being younger, Americans may want to see themselves as something entirely separate or different. But I think Americans will be better off and happier when they see themselves as part of the tree, as a branch of the tree, rather than a new fruit.
It's good. So the upshot for you is the West is not dead.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think so. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's going to be fine. But we get to play a greater or lesser role in the next phase of it. And I look forward to playing a large role in it. But
good. Well, I look forward to you playing that role. Excited to continue reading the books that you write. Excited being, a part of the Wagon Box project here with you, here where we're sort of on the Western frontier in America, but looking backwards at our European roots and really trying to figure out as a project here with all the different people and voices, and we'll be exploring that in other essays and other interviews. What is the future of the West? Does the West have a future? And if so, what does it look like? And how can we be the best possible part of that? And I feel like you're doing the best you can to carry on this tradition forward, both in honoring its past, but also in being part of its reinvention of itself. And I appreciate the work you're doing in that. And I appreciate your involvement here in the Wagon Box project. Look forward to having you back here pretty soon. It'll be fun.
Thank you, Paul.
And see you soon at the Wagon Box. And again, people can find Jack's novel at Passage Publishing. What's the website there?
Passage.press.
Press is published Something of the Springtime. Order it, read it, and get the word out there. It's part of, I think, an exciting time in literature, in the arts, that we're trying to be a part of. There's a new springtime in the West, and part of that is, acknowledging that some things have passed away, but part of that is realizing that something new is being born, but it's being born of, I like that image that you gave of the tree. It's new growth, it's new buds, it's new flowers on an old tree. And we don't want to be cutting ourselves off from the roots there. So cool. Good to talk to you, man. Look forward to talking to you more, and encourage people to subscribe to the Substack. You'll be hearing from Jack and me, and we have some exciting conversations coming ahead where we continue to explore this project. I'm going to be talking to Paul Kingsnorth, who recently had an essay, "The West Must Die," and so it'll bring a whole new perspective. He's out there. He's English.
He's welcome to try.
So we'll continue this conversation. See you next time. Take care.